Hello, gang. It's your Chapo coming at you at the beginning of the week, as always. So we're coming to you today. We, like the rest of the country, have been, experiencing a moment of protest and crisis, still reverberating out from the murder of George Floyd by the police, and ongoing protests in all 50 states of the country against police brutality and racism. And, this is a moment in time when everyone is looking for something to do. They're looking for, how do I do and say the right thing in this moment of increased racial awareness and tension throughout the country. And one of the things that we've noticed this week is that among white people who are looking to fit in now, there have been certain texts and books and films that are being sort of prescribed for you to deal or sort of cope with this current moment, or say the right thing.
White people have been given homework.
Yes, T talked about it on the episode we have with him. There's a lot of reading lists out there, and one of the things on these reading lists has now shot up to the top of the New York Times bestseller list. It is a book called White Fragility by an author called Robin DiAngelo. And, I thought, hey, I'm white. I'm fragile.
I'm a small
maybe
bean.
we should check this out.
I'm a small, soft, fragile
I'm a small bean. Yeah.
White Fragility was the working title of our book.
I'll just say, to join us to discuss white fragility and what to do, how to talk, how to think, we're joined by our friend Jen Pan, who you may remember from the Joker episode, which was, let's be honest, a film about white fragility. And
White male rage, as SNL put it.
And, of course, back from his sojourn among the Philistines, it is our colleague Virgil Texas.
Thanks for having me.
And me as well.
So we all read like a chunk of this book. I did the beginning, but before we get into what's in the book, what do we make overall about this this concept of not just white fragility, but this moment of these sort of prescriptions for how to be a white ally, how to think and how to talk about these things, and this whole slate of, like you said, homework that's been assigned to the country.
So, for my part, the context in which I encountered white fragility is a few months ago. I was assigned to review it for the New Republic. In sort of the broader context of the diversity industry, which, you guys are probably aware is this massive, bloated $8 billion industry, which sort of encompasses anti-racist trainings, sensitivity workshops, cultural competency, implicit bias training. And that is, incidentally, the industry in which this author of White Fragility, Robin DiAngelo, works, right? And so I think that, a kind of interesting component to the conversation is the fact that there's kind of been this, emerging body of literature that talks about how these diversity trainings don't work. They don't reduce people's biases. They don't really make workplaces more diverse. And in some weird cases, they even make people's biases stronger. So I think that's kind of important to keep in mind when you are thinking about, Robin DiAngelo and White Fragility, and how her book is basically a documentation of how these trainings don't work, right?
Yeah.
She is a diversity trainer, right? And her case studies in this book is she goes around to people's workplaces and to their schools and talks to them about racism. And her whole thesis is that white people in the room become extremely uncomfortable. They don't like what they're hearing, and they don't react well to her. So maybe that's, a way to kind of kick off what it is that she's getting at.
I think, too, one of the things that, kept jumping out at me when I was reading this is that she kept saying, I cannot correct or deprogram my unconscious bias and feelings of racial superiority. I will always be like this. I will always, walk around with, latent white supremacy. And I'm like, then why am I listening to you? Why are you the anti-racist trainer? Because she, every other paragraph, she's like, look, I know about racism. Take it from me, a racist. She doesn't do a very good job at justifying her anti-racist credentials, except that she can charge people $10,000 a speaking session for it. I mean, like for like a 2 hour, like it's better than podcaster money, the hourly rate. It's amazing.
Yeah, and if you're never done being racist, then all you can do to work on yourself is, kind of participate in these steps of self-improvement, which of course include buying her book and attending her seminars.
Right.
I mean,
there's no cure. There's a treatment you have to take all the time, always, and keep paying her.
I mean, I guess what was like sort of weird to me about this moment and the required reading as represented here by Robin DiAngelo and White Fragility is that, if we're in a moment where white people are just, once again, perpetually being like, damn, there's a lot of racism in this country. That's fucked up. Like, why, what can I do? It's just like, it would seem to me if you wanted to educate yourself, like maybe read a fucking history book. You know what I mean? Like read any history of the United States, or any like actually like black author who's written about like this. But like this is a white woman, and like the whole thrust of it is through this kind of like corporate HR model, where like every sort of like field of inquiry or sort of tension that she's unpacking here is all like I'm just imagining sitting in like a windowless air conditioned room with a big whiteboard with someone like pointing at me, and the book begins this way with it just begins with like this. I'm just going to read a little bit. She says, "I am a white woman. I am standing beside a black woman. We are facing a group of white people seated in front of us. We are in
You see a turtle on its back."
Yeah, exactly. It's all this Voight Comp test for racism. She says,
a script to a St. Vincent music video.
"We are in their workplace and have been hired by their employer to lead them in a dialogue about race. The room is filled with tension and charged with hostility. I have just presented a definition of racism that includes the acknowledgement that whites hold social and institutional power over people of color. A white man is pounding his fists on the table. As he pounds, he yells, 'A white person can't get a job anymore.' I look around the room and see 40 employees, 38 of whom are white. Why is this white man so angry? Why is he being so careless about the impact of his anger? Why doesn't he notice the effect of this outburst is having on the few people of color in the room? Why are all the other white people either sitting in silent agreement with him or tuning out? I have, after all, only articulated a definition of racism. That white man's name, Maureen Todd."
Dear Penthouse, I never thought this would happen to me.
She does a lot of hypotheticals that not hypotheticals. She does a lot of anecdotes that I'm like, oh, come on. Like,
yeah, at another place in the book, she says something like, "I just can't understand why these white people would react like this upon getting an opportunity to learn about their racism." And that opportunity, of course, as you pointed out, Will, is in the workplace, which, of course, is something that she never bothers to not only just interrogate, but doesn't even acknowledge that, the context in which these trainings are unfolding is quite often, in her case, in the workplace, where, as we all know, there are many different power dynamics already at work. The main one, of course, being between the bosses who organize such workshops and then everyone else who has to attend.
Yeah, it's mandatory. The idea, why aren't you being open to me, the person that your fucking asshole boss paid to yell at you for an hour?
Does she actually never address that?
Never.
No.
Mm-mm. Like, no. Not once. She never mentions that, like, this is a mandatory school assembly where your employer is now being invited to, like, interrogate the most intimate parts of, like, your psyche and brain and experience.
Right. About a very politically charged topic. Like, who the fuck wants their boss talking to them about racism?
Yeah,
I don't.
You guys give me some information that certainly will not be put in your file for later use.
Right.
Yeah, you will not be punished. Well, she mentions that too. At one point, she apparently made a joke about... Also, I get the impression she is very weird around black people.
Oh, she has to be.
And
how could she not be?
The subtext of this book, too, that they never mention is that she's talking about black people. Like, she says people of color, but she's not talking about, like, the Ho-Chunk of Wisconsin or the Hmong of fucking Minnesota. She is talking about black people who, have advanced degrees, and, like, it's just like a very weird thing. It's a Black People Please Like Me book. But, like, at one point she talks about being on a team doing an interview for a new web developer. The web developer is black, and the other two women on the team, she's never, by the way, clear about who's hiring who is the boss in this, who is anyone's superior. That is apparently not relevant information. And she said, well, look, here's what we do. We do these anti-racist trainings. So that's what it is. And the woman was like giving her like a survey and saying like, what do you want from my services? Because, you know, I need information from you. And she's like, look, we do these anti-racist trainings. She's like, and people don't respond well to them. She cannot stop saying that enough. She's just like, look, I'm bad at my job. Nobody likes me. I make people cry and angry all the time.
But they don't punch me because they'd get fired if they did. So it must be working.
Yes, exactly. And at another point, like she said, and you know, one of the people that we gave these trainings to recently, for example, was asked not to come back. She doesn't say fired. She said they were asked not to come back. And then she said he was scared of, so-and-so's hair. And it was like a woman who had like box braids or something.
He went to an anti-racist farm upstate.
Yeah. And she tries to make sort of a joke to this woman that she just met. And she's like, yeah, they were scared of her hair. You know how you guys have different hair? And like, the woman like later points out this makes her, she says to another person that this made her uncomfortable. She's like, I don't know you. You've not been invited to the cookout. We don't have that kind of relationship. And she does a big thing where she atones and she pulls the woman aside and she's like, I would like to apologize and work through the racism that I did to you. Would you be amenable to that? And again, she never mentions if this woman is her employer or not, but they think she is. I think she is. I think she is her inferior. So she's not going to be like, no, bitch, leave me alone.
Well, even if she wasn't inferior, like there's a certain level which you have to humor people in a workplace. And all of this stuff is built in the premise of we all have to get along. And the way we're going to get along is if we're all afraid of getting fired at any moment. We should treat life like we are under the watch of HR at all the times. Like at one point she quotes, no person of color whom I've met has said racism isn't at play with his or her friendships with white people. And you'd think, that sounds sucky. Why would you be friends with somebody who, like, there's always this racial tension? Well, if you work with them and you don't really have a choice but to have some sort of modus vivendi with them, that's true.
Yes.
And those are the only interracial friendships she can imagine are ones that are essentially compulsory because they take place in the workplace.
Yeah.
That's
and like
a consistent thing is that she does not know what friends are. Like, I figured that out very early, and I'm like, oh, you don't have
she has another quote here.
You have
if
colleagues.
Racism is not a topic of discussion between a white person and a person of color who are friends, this absence of conversation may indicate a lack of cross-racial trust. And it's like, maybe, but it could also represent an abundance of trust because it's not something that comes up. That's possible. That's not impossible, but in her mind, that is precluded because once again she's imagining all these relationships in the quasi compulsory context of employer relations.
Love to talk about racism all day with my POC friends.
Well, I mean, this reminds me of, like, again, we're talking about these sort of like prescriptions, these bullet points that are being offered now, directed at white people, like, you know, during a time in this country that, you know, is fraught with, you know, anger, trauma, anxiety over like the, you know, horrendous state of the world. And like the one of them that I remember was like, you know, white people, like check in with your black friends and coworkers and just be like, hey, are you okay? Like, how are you doing right now? Are you like, just what are your emotions like right now during this time of like anger and trauma? And it's just like, well, if they were your friend, you would be generally aware of what's going on in their life in the first place. And if they're not your friend, if they're just your coworker, like keep that shit to yourself. They don't want to hear that from you. Like they don't want you just like leering over your fucking shoulder to just be like, are you okay? You know what I mean? Like, I mean,
I was reading this over and over again. And after making myself laugh because I was high, that after every paragraph, I just kept saying, ma'am, this is a Wendy's. Because it's the most strange sort of environment that she completely decontextualizes. Like she doesn't talk about the fact that this is work, that she makes her money from selling these services and these programs and models. And the subtext is, of course, that this is all to, one, lower liability for corporations for discrimination, and two, make it easier to fire people.
Yeah, just have something else, some problem relationship, some issue that can be then used as cause.
Except it's not a Wendy's ever, of course. It's Unilever, it's Amazon. I'm sure she'll do something for ExxonMobil at some point. But like it's all like universities and like major corporations that she does this for.
Well, what about like the title of the book, White Fragility, which she claims, she coined this term. So like, what is she talking about? What does she mean when she says
you're
white
bragging
fragility?
about that?
Yeah. And what she means is like the fragility comes from like the discomfort, the anger, the resentment that occurs when like ever a white person is asked to confront their place in America's racial hierarchy, or what race means in general, or like that they might in some way be complicit in racism. And she writes here, these include emotions such as anger, fear, and guilt, and behaviors such as argumentation, silence, and withdrawal from the stress-inducing situation. These responses work to reinstate white equilibrium as they repel the challenge, return our racial comfort, and maintain our dominance within the racial hierarchy. I conceptualize this process as white fragility. Though white fragility is triggered by discomfort and anxiety, it is born of superiority and entitlement. White fragility is not weakness per se. In fact, it is a powerful means of white racial control and the protection of white advantage. And when I read that, I was just like, oh, white fragility is like when an armadillo plays dead, It's just, it's a way of like escaping like a dangerous situation. And like the thing is, in reading this book, she writes over and over again about like the importance of, if you're a white person reading this, to really feel the discomfort that like, these concepts and my ideas are causing you, and to just sort of stay in that moment of discomfort. And I was like,
by the way, and this is the phrase she uses, in order to build and this is a term she uses, racial stamina, which sounds a lot like racial hygiene to me. Chris, could we work in a little bit of Tomorrow Belongs to Me for that? I'm not one of those optics people, but the phrase racial stamina is a bit ubermensch.
No,
it's a little, the Rhine gives its gold to the sea.
It's fine. She's just saying that you got to work up your race stamina to do the race marathon, and if you press yourself, you will get a race high eventually.
Race stamina is really more of a dump stat. You should put more into race intelligence or race strength.
Race charisma seems like
if you want to min max. But on the concept of white fragility, I mean, obviously whites are fragile and they need to be wrapped in old newspaper when you move apartments. But I swear, I only read 3 chapters of the book, and all the chapters are very, very short. And I swear, just even within those 3 chapters, she defines the concept of white fragility about a dozen times with a different definition each time, like she's describing different aspects of the same God.
Yeah. No, it's like astrology. It's everything. It's just a lens for looking at things.
It's samsara.
Yeah.
She's really also just like packing in the word count there. Like there is, it's very, very repetitious because it's not a
that, and like I read 3 chapters of it as well, and I was just thinking of like her admonition that like I remain uncomfortable reading it, and to that extent, like she was very successful in writing this book, but like my discomfort stemmed from my just dumbfounded boredom of just reading, again, very repetitive material over and over again. But I suppose that's kind of the point. It has to be sort of driven home. And just I made this note here. This is at the end of the introduction, and I think this gets to the kind of the nut of what she's going for. She writes here, this book is intended for us, for white progressives who so often, despite our conscious intentions, make life so difficult for people of color. I believe that white progressives cause the most daily damage to people of color. And then she goes on here, none of our energy will go into what we need to be doing for the rest of our lives, engaging in ongoing self-awareness, continuing education, relationship building, and actual anti-racist practice. And I think this is where she gets in, is like, this is like this kind of, it's like this self-fulfilling mechanism of people with her job. Is just like, hey, you don't want to be fragile? Well, the way out of it is to like continue to do the work. And you continue to do the work by, again, hiring me, buying these books, continuing to do these things. And the fact that it's saying like white progressives, this is aimed at you. You are actually the worst of all. Yep. Is to just like, oh, well, it couldn't be me. Oh no. Yeah.
This book is a brochure for her services.
Yeah. No, it's absolutely
the fact that she's aiming it directly at the heart of like anxious white progressives is like that's her easy mark that she's going for here.
Yeah.
Specifically women.
The other thing is that nothing that she prescribes, which you just laid out, Will, like educating yourself, sitting with your discomfort, making bullet lists or whatever, None of that is anything. That's not anti-racist action. Like, as the old saying goes, that and $1 will get you a cup of coffee, you know?
Yeah. Well, that the idea behind all this stuff is that racism is foundational and cannot be removed. All it can be done is ameliorated at a personal level. It's like original sin. It can only be atoned for, but then you have to keep atoning. You have to continually atone because you will continually sin because nothing can change. And so it's and the thing is that is a persuasive thing for a certain class of highly educated person for whom the injustice of society is some sort of a psychic burden. This is a way for them to alleviate that burden, but it's a way to alleviate that burden in a context where they never have to relinquish any of their material advantage.
And she, like, her main thesis is that, like, actually, if you're, crying and uncomfortable and horrified, it's good. It means you're working. It doesn't mean that I'm doing a bad job and probably turning normal people into resentful people. Like, you're crying because it's working. And it reminded me of, do you guys remember the original Amber Listerine? Like the mouthwash?
Oh, yeah.
That, like,
right. The non-flavored version?
Yeah, like battery acid.
Right. Tastes terrible. And the instructions on it were like, keep it in your mouth for like 30 seconds or whatever. And growing up, my mom was like, you got to use this stuff. It's the best stuff. And I'm like, this stuff burns my mouth. Yeah. Can we get like the minty kind that tastes like a cookie? She's like, no. That isn't real. That isn't medicine. This stuff is the medicine. The burning means it's working. I remember her saying those words to me. The pain means it's working. Turns out, by the way, years later, you are not supposed to use Amber Listerine very frequently. It's like douching. And you're not supposed to keep it in your mouth for as long as we're on the instructions. It actually fucks up the pH. It dries out your gums. It's fucking bad for you. It's not supposed to hurt. And the stuff that I think she completely leaves out is that, like, actually doing anti-racist work usually does and should feel good. You feel closer to people, not farther away from people. It reminds you that all of the differences between you are being exacted upon you by an external force, and that's not you. And, like, the relationships that you build with people who are unlike you become about who that person is and not about the whatever social, political, cultural externalities to that relationship. It's nice. And it sucks that, like, people are being taught that, by the way, anti-racism, very painful. You're going to cry. You're not going to like it. And it's like, well, then why would they do it?
Well, that's just it. It's assuming an audience. And she says that. She pitches this to progressive whites for a reason. They're the only people who would see this deal and say, sure, and not fuck off. No, thank you.
Yeah,
just like in the Victorian era, it was only bored rich people who would go to Professor Graham's vitality clinic and have yogurt jammed up their ass and fucking graham crackers put in their urethra, because everyone else is like, that's insane. You have to have bought into the premise already. And that is why it's nihilistic, because it assumes, yeah, of course, most white people are going to say, what's in it for me? Because that's how people act about anything. That's why meaningful anti-racist action is class-based, because it gives everybody a stake in changing things for the better, whereas this just gives you a stake in feeling better about how bad things are always going to be.
And not getting fired.
Yeah.
Reading this book, she does stress over and over again that, like, for white people, like the beginnings of this journey begin with you being, like, sort of hyper aware of you as a member of the white race and what that means. And it really reminded me of on the Howard Stern show, used to have this KKK guy call in, and his sort of catchphrase would always be, "Wake up, white people." And I just think, like, I just read this book as the anti-racist version of that, where it was just, attention, white people, like, just, you are white, like, no getting around it, like, so just, you better start thinking about that of yourself in those terms all the time, because everyone else is. And, like, that's how, like, that is your destiny, that is the future, is just you as, like, a white person. And that's it.
And she thinks that's fine.
She uses she thinks it's good. She uses the phrase "fellow whites," which is "hello, fellow whites."
Like, she thinks that's fine
over and over again.
She's imagining that her audience are people who are so fucking comfortable that that thinking of themselves as white can only have positive impacts. Whereas in a reality of steadily and declining standards of living for everybody in this country, racial awareness is the last thing people fucking need.
Yeah, historically speaking, elites developing a white identity has not been good for people of color.
No, but like, I mean, I don't know, like going through this book, like I read the introduction and like the first chapter, which is like the broad overview, and then like her second chapter is about white supremacy and sort of like how race is socially constructed, and then the third chapter is about like the evolution of racism, like post civil rights movement. And broadly speaking, like, you know, she makes the point that like a lot of the way like most white people think of racism in this country is like, well, that happened in the past. Or, you know, it's just like they think of Bull Connor unleashing dogs on people, or like the Ku Klux Klan or things like that. But like regard that, like, you know, the contemporary world is that settled, and like everything is sort of an objective, equal playing field right now. And that bringing it up or being made aware of it is in and of itself racist, which I guess, like, you know, like individually, I don't think she's wrong in that, like, most people's understanding, I'm just saying, like, most people like don't know shit about American history in the first place, and, you know, do react like poorly when they seem to, like, when they are made to feel like implicated in a history of racism or white supremacy in this country.
But her whole thing is, it's like, she's like, well, white liberals have so much trouble talking about racism. Clearly they don't. So they love talking about racism endlessly. They fucking talk about racism.
You see
constantly.
those libs doing that video? They didn't have to do that. Nobody made them do that.
Wait, what?
The lib video, the apology video, all the celebs.
Oh yeah, they love that shit. Like, it's clearly like that's just something they did because they were bored. Like, it's almost like a hobby for them. I don't think they're particularly like smart about it or doing anything productive, but clearly they white libs like talking about racism and how it's bad.
Ray Reid calls that post-racialism, this kind of like condition where, as you say, like white liberals, or I guess liberals of all sorts, sort of set up, I don't know if I would call it a straw man, but they sort of invoke this concept of post-racialism to be like, well, that's not me, and we really need to talk about race. But as you pointed out, they are talking about race all the time. And once again, Robin DiAngelo's paycheck is contingent upon talking about race. So it behooves her to kind of set up the situation where nobody but her is talking about race.
So, like I said, I only read the introduction and the first 3 chapters of this book, but like where else does this go? Because it just seems to me like the book is essentially just the introduction in the first chapter, where she lays out like what her program is and, you know, why you should hire her. But like, what else is in this book?
Honestly, it's pretty repetitive. Where it does get fun is like where she tells you how not to behave when you're in an anti-racist training that you're being forced to and observed by employers at work, where she gives like guidelines where she said, you know, a lot of white people feel like they need to be able to trust before they get into a conversation about race. And it's like, yeah, because they're not fucking stupid. And it's just like the bad guidelines are, you know, don't judge, don't make assumptions, and assume good intentions. And she's like, these are bad. None of these make sense. And intentions don't matter. And it's like, actually, like, I agree that the road to hell and all that, but like, she's not talking to people who are like writing a crime bill. Like, on an interpersonal level, intentions are actually the most important thing. Like, these people aren't building policy.
She also gives like a list of like things that you as like a good white ally can feel and say when you're told in one of these workshops that you're reproducing racism. Those include gratitude, motivation, excitement, humility, compassion. And then some of the things you can say when you're, you know, confronted by your racism is, I appreciate this feedback. This is very helpful. It's my responsibility to resist defensiveness and complacency. This is hard, but also stimulating and important, and so on and so forth.
You know how people talk. Like normal humans,
right.
Normal humans just having,
right.
That's how they talk.
I afraid like you mentioned it before, Amber. You brought it up where it's like she gives an example from her own life where she made a black woman coworker feel or not even coworker. It's not even defined what the relationship is. She made someone feel uncomfortable and then had to make a sort of atone for it. But first she had to ask if that person was okay with her making amends for it. And like that whole dialogue, I was trying to like put my finger on like what it reminded me of. And the first thought I had was like Data from Star Trek: The Next Generation, trying to like relate to learning a new concept about humanity. But then I realized that was like really unkind to Data, who was way more tactful and like aware than this person was.
Well, Data wasn't trying to sell something.
Data was more human than this woman. She does like talk about how it's wrong to like want basic trust, and she says like whites demand comfort. They think that an essential measure of trust is to be nice. And she says, and according to dominant white norms. And it's like, is there a different definition of nice? Are there racial definitions? Like, first of all, you should be nice. I don't know how that's controversial. Like, be nice. It's a bumper. It's a bumper sticker.
If you actually wanted to get across an idea to somebody you don't know, being nice is a good way to start. The idea that, they should accept the abrasiveness, they should accept confrontation because it's the only way they're going to learn. They haven't learned it yet, though. They have to be butted, and that's where the implicit coercion comes in. Because none of this would make sense if the person could leave the room. It only makes sense if they get fired if they leave the room.
Imagine saying that you would approach any other kind of education in this way, where it's like, you piece of shit, third graders, you're learning long division today. It's not the ideal conditions for learning.
No, I think
she's telling people to sort of like resist their basic desire for like human amity or whatever.
Because of my favorite line in the book actually isn't from her. It's from Michael Eric Dyson's intro, where he says this, quote, Robin DiAngelo is the new racial sheriff in town. She is bringing a different law and order to bear upon the racial proceedings. She is dropping the throwdown gun of compassion on the bullet-riddled corpse of discrimination. I mean, that's it. It's all coercive. The idea is everyone has got a gun to their head at all times. And then we're all going to treat each other nicely. Not because we actually feel that way, but because we're afraid of the alternative. And I don't know about you guys, but that sounds like a harmonious social order. That's like the NRA's idea of a polite society.
Yeah. It's all just sort of like psycho cult shit, which I think is intended to sort of justify the fact that people are being subjected to something. It's to smash down like basically the human instinct to be like, this seems weird. And she says at some point, like, you have to let go of the messenger and focus on the message. It's an advanced skill. And it's like, well, some messengers are full of shit and there are conflicting messages. There's, not one big, black people summit where they all agree on what the correct line on something is. You kind of have to actually, the messenger is a very essential part of the whole thing. Like, she's trying to deprogram basic human behavior for what I truly believe is like an insidious design for like PMC sort of employee compliancy and complacency.
And then any like pushback to that, she takes as more evidence of the persistence of white fragility, which again is awfully convenient for her.
Yeah, I'm not bad at my job. They're just awful.
Yeah, Amber, you mentioned it, but I do have a sneaking suspicion. Like I worry that the overall purpose of things like as best embodied by this woman in this book, like serves sort of two functions, at least as far as her professional role goes, which is like one is to justify the need for more, counseling, sessions like this. And the other, I think, like, well, what do the people who hire her get out of it? Like these corporations. And I think like the really insidious thing is I think what they get is like a very covert form of like union busting and kind of like anti-solidarity in a way. It's going to like let's sort of like make all our employees as hyper aware as possible of these like sort of like this this racial anxiety and paranoia, so that they're like they never feel like they're part of a kind of a shared struggle or like a mission, which would be actual like anti-racist practice, is investing people in a shared struggle that you work towards together to better everyone's life. Is because like that when you're invested in that in something like that, I think that is what does do the work that this person is supposedly trying to sell you on, which is like, I don't know, realizing a common humanity, or like dissolving those differences rather than making people sort of hyper aware, and like I said, instilling a kind of like a constant paranoia about it. Not just for white people, but I would imagine if you are one of the 3 black employees that she mentions in these companies, I mean, like I would imagine like after one of these things, like you're not exactly going to feel totally like warm and you're not going to feel exactly completely at ease with your white coworkers when they line up to fucking like ask, do a wellness check on you after lunch
and like say how racist they are.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and also like all of a sudden everyone's looking at you, and it's like, I'm at work. Like I would be mortified. Like I would be mortified if someone even tried to. I've had people like say something offensive to me, and I was like, that was kind of gross. And then their apology later has been so much more uncomfortable than the thing that they said, where I'm just like, please, can we just pretend that this never happened? Like, I'm from the Midwest. I do not want to discuss my feelings with anyone, ever. They're gross. They're disgusting. Also, I'm
let alone at work.
Yeah, I'm at work.
The author seems to not recognize what her actual job is. As someone who, goes to Fortune 500 companies to insulate them from legal liability when an employee does the Chris Rock routine. She keeps saying things like, in her anecdotes, framing them as, this company brought me in to foster diversity. And it's like that. No, they didn't do that. That's never happened.
Yeah, she doesn't, she never uses words like hired or fired. She never uses like, boss, employee. She avoids that completely. And I can't tell, virtually, you might be right. Like for the whole time, I'm like, oh, she's trying to obfuscate this. But she's so weird and doesn't know how to talk to people that she might not know what her job is.
And she's been an academic her entire life.
Yeah, so her job is fake.
Did any of you, or which of you got the section where she's talking about like white women crying, and she's like,
I was just going to ask.
Okay, she's like,
I got white women's tears.
She's like, when I need to cry, I do it quietly, and I go in a corner, and I don't let anyone console me. It's like, holy shit.
Also, by the way, yes, she literally says like, white women don't cry, but also she says, look, I make women cry a lot, but they shouldn't do that. And it's like, I just feel like maybe you're doing a bad job if you're making people cry at work.
There's no crying in Raceball, okay?
Yes. Oh, very good. She says that it's actually killing black people when white women cry. Like, and then she brings up Emmett Till. Like, you are literally putting black people's lives in danger, which actually indicts her because she is making them cry. So it's like, bitch, you are killing black people. Stop making white women cry. It's dangerous. The white women are just like a single gun. You're like the NRA, for fuck's sake.
It's a controlled demolition, I think is the way she would think of it.
Well, okay, but I wanted to talk, like, just go back real quick. We'll talk more about white women's tears because this thing is insane. But Will mentioned sowing paranoia, which is like a constant thing in this book over and over again. Not just where you're being like surveilled and moderated, but also she creates like this like ghost POC that can see deep into your subconscious and see all your badness. She says like, you have racist
That's just
patterns.
called God, Amber.
That's called Black Jesus. You have racist patterns and POC know you have them, which is like this weird combo of like white liberal narcissism where you flatter yourself by like
everyone's thinking of you at all the time.
Yeah, and POC are just thinking about you all the time. They have no internal lives outside of racism. And then also kind of like this weird kind of mystical belief in like that like melanin makes people clairvoyant or something. Like it's like a very weird like they're thinking of you. So it does make you feel like not only are you being surveilled by your boss, but by all the POC, by the POC hive mind who can read your thought.
Yeah, because a panopticon is the only way to enforce this thing. If everyone is always under surveillance, everyone can always be judged and ticketed for racial transgressions, they will never transgress. But of course, they will also never change the views. But that's because these people don't think that's possible. They don't think that those things emerge from malleable and changeable systems of systematic and structural oppression.
Well, one of the things that I was thinking of in this is that like one of the demands that like teachers unions often make is that they want a break room just for teachers with no administration whatsoever, because they need to be able to have a private room where they can talk about work without management watching them. And that historically has been like a really essential foundation of solidarity, particularly in diverse workplaces, like having a private place away from bosses where employees can talk. And what she is suggesting is essentially the obliteration of like these spaces of solidarity, of like the idea everything has to be mediated and moderated through HR who work for management.
Yeah.
Like, there's no idea that, like, if they got together, they might realize they have, like, shared interests and might start to understand each other more and even understand the unique challenges that one another faces based on, you know, their position and identity and stuff. No, we're going to do this. We take the reins on this. We're the boss.
Yeah. I mean, Amazon has an algorithm for detecting which of their Whole Foods locations is most likely to be a potential labor trouble spot. And one of the things that they look for is lack of diversity, because because diversity is can be a dividing tactic by management. They can drop the white frailty bomb if it looks like they're talking too much with each other about organizing. It's like, oh, right. you guys really want to, wow, you guys think you guys want to organize together even with this Karen against us who care about race and made you do the mandatory racial awareness seminar. You're going to let all these Karens dictate what should be going on here just because they want to form a union?
Yeah, well, and also, like, in this situation, diversity is very euphemistic. What I bet a lot of what they're talking about is things like language barriers.
Yeah. But like anything that can be used as a lever, as a wedge. Yeah. And because they control the way that they control what the racial policy and politics and the atmosphere are through their human resources department, so that they could basically like stoke at their discretion whenever they want people to get really tense about race to their own ends.
So we've learned that that white women should absolutely not cry, and if they do cry, there should be some sort of crying pod, perhaps provided by the employer, like sort of like those breastfeeding shacks that they have at airports now. They should have one of those for white women's tears in every workplace and home. And quite frankly, you know, I'm in favor of that. I'm sick of these broads and their emotions. To keep that away from me, ladies. But
I also. The thing that Jen said is true, where she says, you know, I too cry human tears. But when I do it, I go find a corner and I refuse to accept comfort, which, by the way, the I'm fine bitch is the most high maintenance bitch there is. She's way more high maintenance than me, who's just like, I'm mad at you, because then we work through it. The girl that goes in the corner and cries is, in fact, the one drawing attention to herself.
I'm imagining one of her seminars is like the end of Terminator 2, where they slowly lower white fragility into like a molten blast furnace, and then she goes, "Now I know why you cry, but it's something I can never do as a white woman, or something I should never do as a white woman."
She goes underneath the lava and then cries under the lava, so you can't see.
Literally kills black people.
So what about like the middle chunk of the book? Matt, Virgil, what did you learn from your sections of the book?
I learned that white frailty is a varied. It's a land of contrast, and basically anything can be white frailty. It's amazing. All interactions are infused with it. It cannot be divorced from any behavior. It's inherent and instinctual at this point in all white people. and that it can only be neutralized in a moment through basically a full mental concentration on race and the entire history of race in America every time you encounter a black person, because it is about, as Amber says, it's not really about minorities or any kind of like racial diversity. It's specifically about black people. And that the only way to interact with the black people in your life who are implied but never stated outright, all coworkers or employees in her imagining, is to just have a forehead throbbing at every moment to remember the entire history of racial oppression in this country and your specific beneficiary, the fact that you're a beneficiary of it. There is the thing that I found most interesting, though, is that she keeps things so elastic in that way that like horoscopes are elastic, so that everything in your life can be filtered through it and found to be descriptive of it because of it's so broad a brush. At one point, she's talking about the need for white people to acknowledge their privilege and how white people resist acknowledging their privilege because they don't imagine themselves to have privilege, and that they have, but that's not true, and then she rejects the idea that privilege is something that white people have but aren't aware of. She says, no, you are aware of it. She says, she quotes some other race theorist as saying that white people saying that they're unaware of racism or of their privilege. It's like if someone walked by them and just stuffed money into their pockets, they wouldn't be able to notice that, which is an insane comparison. Because otherwise, she stresses that these notions of white superiority are embedded from like childhood, and people get them by age 3. And yet she then, in the same breath, says, "No, you should be hyper aware of them at all moment. And if you aren't, it's because you are being selfish and you're being racist." Even though, by her own architecture, these things are like deeply embedded psychological concepts, but in her mind, it's as obvious as someone literally putting money in your pocket, which does not make sense at all. It's what it is in the moment that justifies, like we've said, reading the book and going to the seminars and using the nootropics that I'm sure the anti-racism nootropics she's going to start selling. I would not be surprised if she started selling anti-racism nootropics off this shit. Like, my new stack will reduce the racism lobe in your brain by 20% and increase your anti-racist folds in your cerebrum.
Well, you know what I think it's going to end up being, and I wait for it because I want to see the Vegas odds on this. Right now this is like Scientology, where you abuse people into saying that they're bad, and then they come out compliant, and you can do whatever you want with them. But what I think she's going to do is sell racist training workshops, where it's like yoga in America is not lucrative, but you know what is like lucrative? It's not lucrative to be a yoga teacher unless you're you have like a personal client that pays you $500 a session. What is lucrative is the schools to teach yoga teachers. So I think she is probably going to branch out from this by training more anti-racist trainers and make it a full multi-level marketing scheme.
There's still going to be
multi-level marketing. MLM is a good model. I like to think that her next move is to sell DVDs where you do the anti-racism moves at home while watching her do them, and something like an anti-racism Bowflex, which I'm kind of picturing as a crash test dummy. That's like a person of color that you put in the DVD and you follow along with your crash test dummy, figuring out how to talk to them, how to use human language.
Yeah.
MLM is a good model too, though.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's all that's left. Everyone's selling each other MLMs. That's it. That's the only growth energy in the economy now.
Amber, and sort of the brilliant thing is that even her own writing sort of acknowledges that doing these things also actually does perpetuate racism and white fragility, even in being aware or talking about them. So it's like a totally vertically integrated system.
Yeah.
Where it's like you create the racism in America. First you create the racism. Then you create the anti-racism. Then you get the money. Then you get the power.
What is that? Not synergy.
Vertical integration?
Vertical integration. Yes.
Yeah.
She's making people more racist, so they have to buy their anti-racism shit. Yeah.
Genius.
She's a genius.
Honestly, we have no choice but to stand.
Yeah.
An entrepreneurial legend.
Yeah.
Well, Virgil, were there ever anything from your section of note?
Yeah, there were a few interesting things, some of which we already talked about because, she peppers her text, and the text is very slim, with these anecdotes about doing the workshop and people being indignant about it, which I thought was just my section, but apparently just the whole book is like this.
Yeah.
If she had taken a single screenwriting class, she'd know that this is where the rising action should be, chapters 7 through 9. But yeah, I mean, I just couldn't get over the fact that she's not making this connection that everyone she talks to is like, fuck off, where they're attending these paid mandatory services. It's like that line that, if everyone you meet is an asshole, well, then it turns out you're the asshole.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like she can't grok the idea that you might be indignant about getting written up because you did a racism, and that, why wouldn't you be indignant? It's literally a punishment having to talk to this person. This isn't a punishment, is precisely what someone says when they are punishing you.
Yep.
Virgil,
it's for your own good. You got to stay in your room all afternoon. It's not
okay,
a punishment.
So there's two interesting things for my section. First, this paragraph was just funny to me. Capital can shift with the field. For example, when the custodian, this is in the context of this mangled discussion of Bourdieu. Capital can shift with the field. For example, when the custodian comes upstairs to speak to the receptionist, the custodian work clothes and the receptionist in business attire, the office worker has more capital than does the maintenance person. But when the receptionist goes down, that's in quotation marks, to the supply room, which the custodian controls to request more whiteboard markers, those power lines shift. This is the domain of the custodian, who can fulfill the request quickly or can make the transaction difficult. The domain of the custodian is a level 40 dungeon. Do not go in unless you have multiple healing spells and a resurrect. But yeah, it's like, I guess in this kind of genre of book, a lot of it is just kind of like bad readings of Bourdieu, because like in her mind, habitus is a kind of racial equilibrium. And when it's disturbed by a person of color asserting their humanity or a brave anti-racism consultant, klaxons go off and a white fragility happens and maintenance droids are summoned to repair the hull breach. That's, again, that's another definition of white fragility that just appears in my chapter. Okay, I have this long anecdote that I think you'll all enjoy. This comes from Chapter 9, White Fragility in Action. So this is the climax. This is where the action happens. This is like the big chase sequence. I was leading a community workshop. Because an employer had not sponsored it, the participants had all voluntarily signed up and paid a fee to attend. For this reason, we could assume that they were open and interested in the content. We could also assume that they're complete sociopaths.
They're freaks.
Yeah.
I was working with a small group of white participants when a woman I will refer to as Ava stated that because she grew up in Germany, where she said there were no black people, which is false, by the way, she had learned nothing about race and held no racism. I pushed back on this claim by asking her to reflect on the messages she had received from her childhood about people who lived in Africa. Surely she was aware of Africa, had some impressions of the people there, had she ever watched American films. I also asked her to reflect on what she had absorbed from living in the U.S. for the last 23 years, whether she had relationships with African Americans here, and if not, why not? We moved on, and I forgot about the interaction until she approached me after the workshop ended. She was furious and said that she had been deeply offended by our exchange and did not, quote, feel seen. You made assumptions about me, she said. I apologized, and I told her I would never want her to feel unseen or invalidated. However, I also held up to my challenge that growing up in Germany would not preclude her from absorbing problematic racial messages. She countered by telling me that she had never even seen a black person before the American soldiers came. And when they did come, all the German women thought them so beautiful that they wanted to connect with them. That was her evidence that she held no racism. With an internal sigh of defeat, I gave up at that point and repeated my apology. We parted ways, but her anger was unabated. A few months later, one of my co-facilitators contacted Ava to tell her about an upcoming workshop. Ava was apparently still angry. She replied that she would never again attend a workshop by me. So I just want to pause and ask, how many white fragility workshops is this person attending just on a monthly basis.
Yeah, this is like one of those people that just spends their money on improv classes, and it's like, you're not getting on SNL. It's not going to happen.
It is kind of like an improv class, isn't it? I mean, there are games.
Yeah.
There's structure to it.
Yeah, give me a POC. Give me an axis of oppression.
But on the flip side of that, if you're sending out these promotions to people who have already attended the White Fragility workshop, aren't you admitting the workshop doesn't work?
It has to be constantly reinforced.
It's not like there's new scientific developments in the field of white fragility that's like, it's like 80% new content.
See, but that's just it, because it has to be reinforced, because you have these ingrained things that are beyond conscious, and they have to be extirpated repeatedly. You have to keep reminding yourself. And that's why I think that she's eventually going to get a nootropic, because what if you're on the go and you don't have time? You want to get rid of racism, but you can't go to a monthly session. Just pop a pill every day, and you'll have the same anti-racism, anti-racist antioxidants going through your system.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to finish out this. She diagrams her interactions with Ava. Let's start with the common emotional reactions that white people have, and that Ava demonstrated when our assumptions and behaviors are challenged. Feelings: singled out, attacked, silenced, shamed, guilty, accused, insulted, judged, angry, scared, outraged. The Will Menaker experience. When we have these feelings, it is common to behave in the following ways, as Ava did: crying, physically leaving, emotionally withdrawing, arguing, denying, focusing on intentions, seeking absolution, avoiding. The Will Menaker girlfriend experience.
I was going to say the Will Menaker managerial style, but yeah, that works too. That works too. I guess just like, for me, like, just to echo what you said, Virgil, like there's a part in the introduction of the book where, again, just to underscore this idea that like she's routinely shocked and taken aback just how often people really don't like attending her seminars or talking to her. And she says here, the very idea that they would be required to attend a workshop on racism outraged them. They entered the room angry and made that feeling clear to us throughout the day as they slammed their notebooks down on the table, refused to participate in exercises, and argued against any and all points. I couldn't understand their resentment or disinterest in learning more about such a complex social dynamic as racism. And my note there is like, just fundamentally back again to our original point, I can't imagine why anyone would resent having to do this as part of their fucking office hours of shit they have to do. Like, they probably have emails they have to answer and shit that they're probably freaking out about. They got to spend 2 hours where it's just like, yes, racism is this horrible, like, intractable problem in our society, but it is so weird that like we're coming up with like the medium through which we are going to deal with this finally is the office. Shit that you have to do at work, which is just like that. I can't help but feel it's just a recipe for disaster.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, it's not designed to do anything about racism too. But like, this is the kid I realized that we all hated, who would ask for more homework, and then would be shocked when people are like, "Why do we have to do this extra thing?" She's like, "No, it's fun. We're getting better at math." But like, the idea of this being outsourced too has a secondary effect, because again, these are PMC jobs. It has this secondary effect of credentializing and professionalizing anti-racism as a practice, and essentially making it into an elite consumer good that some people can't afford. And you know what that means is that all of those poor people, there's no way they could be anti-racist. Look, I got the certificate. I passed the course. And why would we ever trust these elite institutions to even be able to administrate something like that when they are major factors in, like, the academy, the corporate world? They're historically major factors in the production of racism. I mean, Charles Murray has a degree.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but my boss is my friend, and he wants me to be unracist because he likes me, and he thinks it would make my life better.
I will say that something that validates the author's thesis here is that for the vast majority of people, having to go to an employer-mandated anti-racism workshop, you're just going to turn your brain off for 4 hours and just try to not be involved to whatever degree that you can, kind of like how girlfriends have to act when there's a new Martin Scorsese movie out on a streaming service, which means that the only people that she ever really interacts with are the people who get really indignant about the workshops because they don't have the social skills to just be like, oh, this is a bullshit thing. All right, whatever.
Yeah.
And just zone out. Because all the people in her book are just people with no chill whatsoever.
Yeah. I'm guessing too that she like obviously she's going to focus on those people who probably have let's be honest, other social issues that they're dealing with.
All of them.
Things going on in their life. Because again, well-adjusted people are just like, this is bullshit. Just keep your head down.
Ava said she didn't feel seen. That's okay.
Yeah. That's a weird person.
That Ava was Ava Braun, by the way.
That was Ava Braun. Yeah.
One of the women. By the way, the one chapter I read about anti-blackness, it was the next chapter. I just noticed that one of the women in one of the anecdotes is actually named Karen.
There was another anecdote where she was brought in by a company to help them do a diversity, and they said, the last anti-racism workshop we did left people traumatized. So
why are you doing this?
Anyone who's actually actively grappling with this sort of, fucking event that your employer forces you to do is basically going to be saying shit like that.
I guess to tie it back to the current moment, what I couldn't stop thinking about when I was reading this was, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, Jay Carney, who was of course Obama's former press secretary and is now high up in the PR arm of Amazon.
He ran the White House. He ran the White House tilt-a-whirl.
So Jay Carney 2 weeks ago went to a Black Lives Matter protest in Washington Square Park, and of course posted a selfie of himself. He's got the mask on. He's at the protest, and he's like, I'm here to support Black Lives Matter and George Floyd and this important moment in American history. And not even 2 or 3 weeks prior to that, Jay Carney had been spearheading an effort on behalf of Amazon to slander a black man who was trying to form a union at an Amazon fulfillment gulag in Staten Island, and publicly slandered this person by saying that he was fired for being lazy and incompetent and through his efforts to form a union and gather people in a single space was putting his fellow coworkers at risk for COVID. So this guy had no problem slandering a black man for voicing his humanity or standing up for himself in any way against his fucking employer, which is the biggest company in the world, on behalf of a fucking literal trillionaire like Jeff Bezos. And then this asshole can just show up at a fucking Black Lives Matter protest and be like, hey, it's me, Jay Carney. I support all the good things. I don't have white fragility. Whereas just I can't help but think that this is really what's at play here, is that it gives assholes fucking a walking fucking piece of shit like Jay Carney the tools to fucking shield themselves from any what is essentially their inhumanity to other people.
It's an alibi for elites.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do
I was going to ask you guys why you think the book has been so popular. I think someone mentioned it's number one on Amazon now. Even before that, it was
number one on the New York Times bestseller list. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a theory. I have a thesis on that, and these were from my notes. So there was a recent Onion article, white ally willing to do whatever it takes to make sure people aren't mad at him. And the dominant affect that I can detect is anxiety. And I think that's the grease between the two cogs of neoliberalism and algorithmic media. Anxiety is the modern product of this ancient conflict between trying to be a morally good person and living in, perhaps being complicit in, or feeling complicit in a society that is, by virtually all measures, bad. And people try to treat this anxiety symptom with the same products of what is generating it. Buy this book, listen to this podcast, post the square, use the hashtag, don't use the hashtag, whatever. Within this framework, you're going to get grifters and quack salvers multiplying because people are seeking an easy solution to an intractable problem. You can take an aspirin to treat your headache, but there'll still be a malignant tumor in your brain. And because all of this is being worked out publicly for the consumption of others, and because we all have the tumor, treating your own symptom usually just exacerbates the symptoms of everyone else. And although there isn't anything per se wrong with taking the aspirin, in my opinion, if your only concern is treating the symptom, you'll never cure the disease. This is a snake oil. It's a placebo. But the thing is, placebos work, so it's fine.
Yeah.
Until you don't have to think about racism again.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like if you're reading this and it's making you feel like you have transcended these categories, that you have for just the moment you're reading it, burned off the taint of racism, then you're going to feel better about yourself.
You're taking painkillers after surgery, and the next time you have surgery, you'll take the painkillers again for most people. But some people just get addicted to the painkillers, and then they become involved in the white fragility MLM scheme.
Yeah, one of the chapters that I read was about beyond the good-bad binary, and the argument is a lot of people reject the idea that they have racial insensitivities within them because they have defined themselves as good, and racism is a bad thing. And since they're not bad, therefore they can't be racist because racism is, an overt act as opposed to an attitude. That's the way and she writes a whole chapter saying, no, that's not correct. But the entire premise of the book is that, yeah, you can be good or at least better by reading the book.
Yeah, she really undermines her own job and the value of what she does, definitely. Like over and over again, she's like, look, I sell this, seminar series and nobody likes it and people get mad at me and cry and it makes them worse.
They throw paper at my head.
Yeah.
Just like improv.
Yes, exactly. And you just got to keep doing it. But I think Virgil is right, is that people are really anxious. And I think it's people are, especially, since Ferguson, they are like, oh shit, there's this whole big problem and I don't know what to do about it. So here's a small thing that I can do because the problem seems so big and it's very complicated. Policing in America is really complicated. And the fact that we have like a federalist system where our police departments aren't even nationalized. They don't have like national oversight. It's all local and state, everything. It's really, really hard. And, and it's difficult. And I think people are genuinely not just worried about what other people think about them, which by the way, isn't totally, morally bankrupt either. Of course you want to be recognized as a good person, but like, they don't know what to do. So they do this because it's a retreat from politics, because the politics that would be involved in dealing with something like police violence are so daunting and so confusing. And if you do it wrong, it might get worse. And like, that's a lot of pressure. I would rather read the White Fragility book.
As well, I think our political options engaging with this issue through politics has largely been foreclosed upon, at least in the past several decades. Mm-hmm. And that's why we marched in the streets over the past 2 weeks, because the lack of any other option to do anything except a simple physical act of defiance, a reflexive act.
Yeah, and it makes you feel like, okay, well, at least this is a little bit of something where I can feel powerful and I can feel close to people, because our institutions have been hollowed out. Labor's been on its back forever. People are worse off than they've been for a very long time since the post-war period. It's been a steady decline, and we don't really have any tools or organizations or institutions that we could use to wield power. So it's either marching through the streets, which I think is like it can become therapeutic, and it can become people can forget that it's a means to an end, and it can become a trap too. But it's certainly more human and has more political potential than reading the White Fragility book.
Certainly. I view it as an instinctual response. And that's good. That gives me a lot of faith in people, that they have not necessarily the answers, but the moral framework to understand, that this is wrong, this is all going bad.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's something to build on, and that impulse, that anxious desire to be a good person is something that can be utilized.
I guess just like Jen, you said
not through the book, obviously.
Yeah.
Jen, you reviewed this book for the New Republic, and I guess like just overall, like the things that people are trying to grapple with, like on their own, I don't think worthy of scorn or derision. Like, you know, being a better person, being a more conscious person, trying to combat racism in any way that individually you're able to, or that maybe trying to separate yourself from things that you've said or done in the past that maybe, you know, weren't good or did make people feel uncomfortable or angry or something like that. But like, do you see a way out of like any of the sort of trap that this book would seem to corral people in, like that takes what are, like I said, on their own good and commendable instincts and sort of channels it into this weird, like I said, psychological stalemate for both the intended audience, which are of course like affluent, privileged white people, and the people that it's supposedly trying to help, which are their black co-workers or employees or just black people in general. Like, is there a way out of this psychological stalemate?
I mean, I think it's hard because, you know, I feel like what Rob and DiAngelo would say is that you need to do all this work. You need to work on yourself before you can actually, you know, engage in some sort of more substantive anti-racist action. And I think that's actually a very sort of popular formulation among liberals and among some segments of the left as well. Like, you need to do kind of this like psychological evaluation and like rid yourself of racism before, you know, you can work in solidarity with other groups. But of course, you know, that's kind of this fundamentally like non-materialist understanding of how like change happens, right? And I feel like, you know, we would say that the transformation is more likely to happen in the act of the class struggle itself. And that's just not something that her framework can like account for. So, you know, and I keep bringing this up over and over again, but the fact that, you know, she makes money from kind of believing in the latter interpretation of how change happens is awfully convenient.
Yeah, I wanted to throw in this one thing here. I sent an email to some friends about this because there's a book called Anti-Racist Baby.
How do you get one?
Yeah, I want one of those anti-racist babies.
Amber, I was going to announce my memoir on another show, but I suppose now that the cat's out of the bag.
And it's doing very well, which is insane because if you know anything about like children's pedagogy, like it doesn't, like the illustrations aren't very good, and like it's a what they call a board book where it's like pictures and stuff, and ostensibly it's meant for babies, but like the language of it doesn't make any sense for babies who. They kind of go into it. It's like, you know, anti-racist baby sees all the colors. Anti-racist baby does not claim to be colorblind. And it's like, well, it's true that babies notice difference, but like they sort people sort of arbitrarily aesthetically. They definitely see nothing but faces. But like to ascribe a concept like race to a baby, like ignores the fact that they kind of think the dog is a person. Like it doesn't understand babies.
Well, is the idea to be like the anti-racist baby? Is that why you're reading it? Like to tell your baby to be like the anti-racist baby, or the yes. parent to be like the anti-racist baby?
I think that it's sort of like Teen Vogue, where actually all the women reading it are 35.
Yeah, right. So they're all going to be baby, and instead of being baby, they're going to be anti-racist baby.
Yeah. But like it's being sold as a like, you know, you're supposed to show it to your baby and be like, why can't you be more like anti-racist baby, you piece of shit? But I was interested in this, and so I did a deep dive on that. I'm just going to read from this email on the sort of history of anti-racist children's pedagogy, and there's been like a massive and I think cyclical liberal moral panic about kids' books since at least the 1950s. And from very early on, there's been discomfort with criticism of books that feature non-white characters that are not didactically anti-racist. And the whole like children's pedagogy world at this point, it's very like insular and weird. And it's all these, you know, women that went to like Seven Sisters colleges and are very progressive or whatever. But I didn't know this, but the book Ezra Jack Keats's The Snowy Day. Does anyone know this? LeVar Burton?
No, never heard of it.
I remember that one, yeah.
Yeah.
I think I know.
Okay, so it's about a little black boy that plays in the snow. And it's like incredibly popular. It is apparently so controversial among these like children's pedagogy. By the way, people into kids' books, psycho. So
even kids that are into kids' books are psycho. Play video games. What's wrong with you?
Be normal. Play violent video games.
Yeah, play Grand Theft Auto. Put that book down.
So children love The Snowy Day, but like the thing is, kids have really bad taste and love a lot of terrible stuff. And The Snowy Day is exceptional, and it's beloved by adults because it's like really pretty, and it's like a good kids book that parents don't mind staring at. The art's really beautiful, and it's just not like anything else in like children's illustration. It's really modern and like cool and urban, but it's still like warm. It's not like cute, which is like a relief a lot of times for parents who are sick of horrible children's entertainment. And it was originally very popular, but then there was this huge controversy because a lot of people backtracked their endorsement of the book after finding out that it was written not by, as they had assumed, a black man, but by a white Jewish man who grew up in a diverse tenement housing in Brooklyn. And the reason for why this makes the book bad is like all over the place, that it's like dishonesty on Keats's part by omission. Like he should have said, you know, by Ezra Jack Keats, parenthetical, a white man.
By Ezra Jackson Keats, 3 parentheses around the name.
Well, actually, his original name was Katz, and he changed it to Keats because the publishing industry was really anti-Semitic. And then some people were mad. They said he should have referenced Peter's blackness and be like, one day a black child woke up. It would have been the introduction to The Jerk. And then my personal favorite, that it's bad because Keats couldn't possibly understand a black experience. Ah, yes, the uniquely black experience of being a kid that plays in the snow. And there was this 1965 article, a sort of predecessor to DiAngelo's whole industry, The All-White World of Children's Books by this progressive educator and childhood literacy advocate, Nancy Lyric. And it's considered a landmark in the little world of like liberal children's pedagogy. But anyway, the Peter books became a massive franchise, and to my knowledge, Keats never wrote one that explicitly referenced Peter's race, which ironically enough is what preserves their timelessness. In her article, Lyric fretted that many of the simplest picture books show Negroes in the illustrations, but omit the word. Can you imagine a contemporary liberal parent reading a book to their kid with the word Negro in it? Which brings me to like this vulgar Marxist point that one of the reasons like anti-racist books and anti-racist children's books are more popular than books that are quote unquote race blind or color blind is that there are always updates and upgrades to be made to the discourse and language around race. So books about race and racism are always going to be much better for the book industry and for sales than just books by and for and about people of color.
Right.
Like this stuff, I think, occurs at the expense of actual publishing diversity or whatever. And it's like the reason this book is timeless is because it's just about a black kid. If it was an anti-racist book, it would be immediately out of date because it would use the word Negro, which was the politically correct term at the time. Anyway, it's just sort of a point that it's like, obviously, like this industry it's more lucrative to publish about race and racism than it is to just publish people of color telling stories about people of color who have internal lives that are not purely mediated by their relationship to white audiences trying not to be racist.
I just think overall, though, if you're talking about children, you're talking about babies, whether they're racist babies or anti-racist babies, they should be protected from pedagogues at all costs. And I just, if I see if all pedagogues should be like taken in a plane and it should be crashed into a mountain.
You know what?
That's what I think, and I'm not afraid to say it.
No
They gotta put them on a list, man. There should be a public list of published pedagogues.
A pedagogue registry?
A pedagogue registry fund.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I don't think we've solved racism.
Nope, we did. It's done. I think we can all pat ourselves on the back. We solved racism, at least in the podcast world.
I feel a little less fragile at the end of all of this. I think that's what this book has given me. I mean, just the act of getting through it was sort of it toughened me up in a lot of ways. And I've read a lot of bad shit for this show, so I thought I was tough. But this book showed me that no, I'm actually just like a little orchid, ready to wilt at even the slightest heat or pressure. So I think that about does it for this week. I want to thank you, Jen Pan, for coming on and actually read it. You're the only one of us who's actually read all of this book, so thank you for that.
Thanks for having me on.
Jen, you did the work,
Lucky
and
me.
I would just hope that, like Jen, you, the listener, will continue to stew in your discomfort.
Get a good bouillabaisse going with your discomfort.
But and just if I could use this platform to get any message out there about myself, I just would like to say, in echoing the celebs, I am responsible. I am responsible for every cringe reply that you see. That's not separate from me. That's me. Every bad podcast that you now feel compelled to listen to, like me personally, Will Menaker, I'm literally responsible for that. So I think just me admitting that is a first step towards doing and getting better.
Thank you, Will.
Thank you, Will.
Thank you.
I'm proud of you. You just got to do that every day for the rest of your life, and you might get somewhere.
Good boy.
Well, until next time.